very much, Laurie and Mallika. Thank you. Let's welcome Mallika Dutt from Breakthrough. I'm sorry. Oh,
Thank you so much, Arturo, and thank you all so much for inviting me to be here with you all today and tomorrow. Time of great learning and listening for me. This is not my usual stomping ground, so it's exciting to meet new people who are players in the space that I've been playing in now for the last 16 years, and that's really what I call the place of culture change. So Breakthrough's really in the business of culture change, and we have a focus on trying to make violence against women and girls unacceptable. And what I want to do today is really just share with you one of the campaigns that we did that was about engaging men in challenging domestic violence, and show you a short video and then just share some reflections and learnings from that experience that are not really going to be about, well, what did the baseline say and what did the end lines say, or any of the research findings, which I invite you to go and look at on our website, but really just to share my own reflections on what it has meant to do this work and kind of where I stand today in some of the insights that have emerged as a result of this. So I'm going to just go ahead and start with the video. Can we lower the lights, please? There's no sound.
हिम्मत कैसे हुई तुम्हारी? How dare you?
क्या किया मैंने?
क्या किया? झूठ बोलने की आदत पड़ गई है तुमको? Just because I don't say anything. तुमको बस एक ही भाषा समझ में आएगी. एक ही.
Yes, an error did occur. The error was that somebody was about to be violent to his wife. That's an error. Let's see if we can make this, otherwise I'll just enact the whole thing.
हिम्मत कैसे हुई तुम्हारी? How dare you?
क्या किया मैंने?
क्या किया? बोलने की आदत पड़ गई है तुमको? Just because I don't say anything. तुमको बस एक ही भाषा समझ में आएगी. एक ही. एक और बार अगर ऐसा हुआ ना तो मैं
एक फोन कर सकता हूं? हेलो जी, अब मैंने ही फोन किया था.
जैसे हम लोगों के पड़ोस में भी काफ़ी घटनाएं होती हैं और हम लोग उसको नज़रअंदाज कर देते हैं, उसको इतनी ज़्यादा गंभीरता से नहीं लेते हैं. लेकिन जिस तरह से बिल बचाव के बाद हम लोगों ने जाना कि उन चीज़ों को भी देखना चाहिए.
हमारे बगल में हुई थी लड़ाई, हस्बैंड वाइफ में हो रही थी, तब मैं उनके यहाँ बेल बजाने गई और उनसे कहा, और मैंने उनके यहाँ चाय पत्ती मांगी थी. हमारे जिया जी आए थे तो उनके यहाँ फिर लड़ाई बंद हो गए और तब उनके आज तक अभी तक लड़ाई नहीं।
इस ट्रेनिंग के बाद मुझमें वो हिम्मत सी आई है और मैं और भी जो महिलाएं आती हैं उनमें भी मैं वही हिम्मत डालने की कोशिश करती हूँ कि अपने आप को एक स्ट्रांग बनाओ, अपने आप में एक हिम्मत लाओ, जो कि मुझमें अब आ चुकी है।
I'm Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General of the United Nations. Billions of men and boys in many countries are stopping this violence just by lifting one finger. In Hindi, it is called bell bajao, which means ring the bell.
Sao tôi đi làm đây? Hả?
Thank you. Are you my timekeeper? And will you give me a 5 and a 1 then? Thank you. So I want to share a little bit of a story. I was working at the Ford Foundation as the Human Rights Program Officer and had just come into that role after the Beijing conference on women that had happened in '95. You know, I had been involved in sort of the global women's movement that had demanded the recognition of women's rights as human rights and really the inclusion of women in the ways in which various UN agencies even address the issue of gender. And prior to that, I had co-founded an organization in New York City that worked with battered South Asian women. I had been trained as a lawyer, so I was representing individual women as well as joining the fight at that time in the United States for the Violence Against Women Act, particularly the battered immigrant women's exception at the time. And so by the time I got to the Ford Foundation, I had obviously been working in the space of human rights and the issue of addressing violence against women in multiple ways. And one of the things that I started to reflect on was how in the movement we tended to speak in language that was incredibly exclusionary, and that we tended to speak in ways that not even each other could understand most of the time, forget about anybody else that was in the larger space. And you know, my parents, after 20 years of me having been a human rights advocate, still didn't really quite understand what it was that I did. The other thing that I was really reflecting on was that, you know, we were dealing with a lot of issues after the fact, after the violence had already happened. And that what we really needed to be thinking about was how could we turn the tap off in the first place? How could we really incorporate a prevention strategy, address the underlying causes of violence as opposed to just trying to build a battered women's shelter for every woman that was experiencing violence on this planet, which would mean that we would have to have a battered women's shelter on pretty much every block. So as I was reflecting on those things, the other thing that was really also bugging me was the whole question of scale. As organizations working in this space, particularly women's organizations who receive an extremely tiny fraction of the overall development philanthropy budget, you know, all of our efforts were very localized, and even the largest women's organization had a tiny little budget compared to Oxfam or Greenpeace or any of the other sort of larger entities. So the whole idea of how to engage in a narrative arc and storytelling that engaged people in the conversation and brought them into part of being the solution, for me then got connected to the use of media, arts, and technology as a vehicle for having both local conversations and conversations at scale. So in the campaign that I just showed you, which is Bell Bajao or Ring the Bell, the idea was, how do we make the private space, which is the home, which is used as a way to excuse cultural manifestations of violence, what is the way in which we make that a public site of intervention? How do we shift the ways in which men show up on the issue, where they're not just the perpetrators, but really can be part of a larger solution? And not just saviors, right? Like, we also wanted to get out of this triangle that we often create of the perpetrator, the victim, and the savior. And then, we keep sort of dancing around this triangle over and over again. So how does one create sort of that accountability of men showing up as part of the solution, but challenging the norms of masculinity that are leading to violence in the first place? And also, as you saw in the video, how do you connect sort of the mass media strategy with the community-based work? So for us, we bring together community-based leadership development and capacity building of key constituencies that may need to be moved in the ecosystem that we're trying to change. We engage in deep partnerships. So Ogilvy is our creative advertising agency partner, and it was a young man at Ogilvy that actually came up with this campaign that went totally viral, began to be replicated in various parts of the world. Have a very strong sort of learning and sharing component to our work as well. And so the use of media, arts, and tech becomes a pillar within a larger integrated strategy. But what it allows us to do is have local, national, and global conversations. It also allows us to do that scale work that even if you are a small organization, you can sort of connect and have influence around a much larger public dialogue. And certainly the means of production and the way in which media has evolved allows us to step into that in a much more inclusive and a much easier way than even when we created this campaign, which was about 8 years ago. You've already heard all of this, so I feel like I'm kind of just reciting all of the good practices, best practices that we've learned. So I'm actually going to leave you with this. I went on sabbatical this summer. It was the first time in 30 years that I had had an opportunity to step out of the work that I do on a daily basis around human rights issues, which are deeply embedded in the larger culture of fear and scarcity that our planet is built on. All of the norms around violence come from that underlying culture, rather I would say the sea that we swim in. I was in the Sacred Valley in Peru, and I found myself one day walking through this valley towards the salt flats. And in that moment, the 30 years of doing this work and all of the trauma that sat in my body as a result of doing this work just opened up like a dam. I cried for 4 hours as I walked in this beautiful valley, and I was held, and it's called the Sacred Valley for a reason, because the mountain spirits, these beautiful, glorious mountains, held me as I cried and dealt with what it means for us to even be engaged in this work. What it means that many of us ourselves have been affected by the things that we're working on, whether it's in our homes, whether it's because we may have seen our parents in violent and abusive relationships, or because we ourselves are victims of sexual abuse in some way, or all of the myriad ways in which being less than on the basis of your sex or your gender then intersects with race or your immigration status or your class status. We live in a culture that is a power over culture. And violence and the threat of violence is an integral part of how that power over culture is maintained. I end with this because I really want us to understand how critical the work is that we are doing, how important and significant it is that we step into these spaces of violence where human beings do some of the worst possible things to one another in unimaginable ways on a daily basis. That's what we do. And so I want to actually say thank you and really recognize what that means for each and every one of us. I also invite us, and that's the gift that my sabbatical gave me, to make sure that we take care of ourselves, that we also remember the magic and the mystery and the joy of this planet, of this miracle of life that we are a part of, that we sometimes just lose sight of because we are in the violence world. So my invitation is, yes, let's make sure that we get our collective wisdom together to address the largest human rights pandemic on this planet, which is violence or manifestation of our culture. And let's also remember why we want to end violence, because it's this world that we want to create that is about joy, that is about power with, that is about working together to dream a new world into being. Thank you.